Hey there. In this video, I want to give you some information and help you decide on which lenses to use and purchase for your Canon C70. Now, before this point, all the Super 35 Canon cinema cameras had an EF mount, so this is the first one with an RF mount. Now, that's what kind of makes this challenging to figure out which lenses to use. Now, it's awesome that there's an RF mount on here because it opens up a lot of possibilities. Of course, we have access to the awesome RF lenses that you can get from Canon, but with some simple adapters, you can adapt all sorts of other lenses to this camera, and that's where it gets confusing because it opens up so many possibilities and it's hard to decide. So that's what we're going to get into in this video. Now, I didn't want to make this sort of stereotypical, here's what you should buy for your C70, because people use this camera for all different reasons and all different applications and all that kind of stuff. So what I did is I brought in a few buddies here that are C70 owners. They're going to talk about what they use their cameras for and the lenses they decided to use on their C70s.
All right, thanks Josh for having me. If you guys don't know me, my name is Andrew Murphy and I'm a cinematographer from down under in Gold Coast, Australia. So I've been shooting on the Canon C70 basically since it was launched, and this is my go-to cinema rig setup. So basically I use cinema lenses for basically majority of my stuff. So my go-to is the Makey Super 35mm cinema lenses. They also make a full frame one as well, which probably would be good because then I could have adapted it to the, I guess with the Speedbooster for this, but I started getting the Super 35mm one, so I want to continue getting that full set. And basically the lenses that are the focal lengths that I use, mostly the 25mm, the 50mm, and the 75mm. I do have the 35mm as well, but since getting the 25, the 35 is kind of like an in-between that I don't really use as much. And honestly, these lenses are just such good value for money. They're just super crispy, super clean, and just work so good with my setup. But when I'm not shooting like commercials and stuff where I have a lot of control over the lighting and like being able to focusable and stuff, my go-to lens is actually the Canon 24-105 f4L. And I do love pairing this with the Viltrox Speedbooster. I've noticed that the Viltrox Speedbooster doesn't have as much of that like purple tint fringe thing that was going on in Josh's video. Although you do lose a little bit of contrast, but I don't really mind that because I usually shoot with the Pro Mist anyway, which I guess bumps up the contrast, and making this, I guess, like a full frame equivalent and getting that extra chop of light makes this such a good all-round lens, considering it has IS built in as well. And finally, I also have this PL to RF adapter as well. So I have used this to shoot with the Atlas Orion anamorphics. I guess I wouldn't say they're the best anamorphics to use with the C70 because they have a 2x squeeze and you just lose too much resolution. But like, you know, like a 1.5 times anamorphic is something if they only come in a PL mount, this is the kind of thing you need and it works so good. But yeah, C70, such a good camera. Man, the image that comes out of it is just insane. And if you do have one, or if you're looking at getting one, highly recommend. So good.
Dave Mays here to talk about my favorite two lenses that you may not have used on the C70. First off is the 17-55 f2.8 IS. This lens comes in pretty cheap. You can find these online used for like $300-400. Do not buy these new. They're still being sold for like $700 or $800 on B&H. Not worth it at all. This lens is super old, but it has great bokeh, great image quality, and when paired with the C70, because it's a cropped sensor lens, it fits naturally right on the body. You get full use of the lens. It's not that heavy. It mounts on beautifully with the adapter, of course, and this one lens can essentially do everything you would ever need. Now, there are a couple downsides with it. It's a little slow to autofocus, but it does get the job done. It's also a little bit loud when you use the autofocus. The build quality is a little cheap, but the optics are great. Some say it's actually L-series glass equivalent optics. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it is very sharp. It's got great bokeh, and it's got built-in IS, which paired with the C70, which obviously doesn't have IBIS, works a treat. So super affordable and a great all-arounder. And then my second favorite lens is this 10-18 millimeter, the 10-18 f4.5 to 5.6 with IS. This lens, talk about tiny, is extremely small, and with the just simple adapter RF to EF, it still stays really lightweight, really simple. And pair that with a nice little on-camera mic like the one I have here from Deity, and you have a really solid run and gun, wide angle vlog kind of setup. Now, obviously, a C70 is gonna be a little bit big for most people, but for the type of work that I do, I find this is a really solid option. I often shoot outdoors, and shooting at f4.5 to 5.6 isn't an issue for me when I'm using this lens because I'm using it around its limitations. The C70 has really really good low light. And the autofocus on this lens is completely silent. This is an STM lens, and the IS on this is also really solid. So I actually use this little kit here, this exact setup, to film my kids. I find this is the perfect little run and gun home documentation setup. Those are my two favorite lenses for the C70, and it's kind of my little workaround for the issues with using the turbo booster and the big EF lenses, which are very heavy. These are much smaller, lighter, and way more affordable.
All right, Josh, thank you for having me on to talk about my choices for the C70. Now, I'm actually a Sony shooter by trade. I say by trade as in like what I use for making money. But Josh has been talking me into a C70 for the longest time. But I do love this camera so far, and one of the toughest things I had to decide when I was buying this is which lenses do I want to buy. I'm obviously a Sony user, so I don't want to have to invest in a whole new set of glass. So it was a lot of thinking and back and forth to ultimately decide on what lenses I ended up picking. Now, I knew I wanted to stay away from using the Speedbooster. I know there is a lot of issues with that. Josh has talked about it. Many other people have talked about it, like Potato Jet, that little purple circle in there. As nice and as appealing as the EF lenses are, being a lot cheaper than the RF lenses, I didn't want to have to go that route and use that Speedbooster. So I ultimately ended up selling on the 1535 f2.8. And I've got to say, for what I've been using it so far, which is it's a lot of little things here and there. B camera to go with my Sony cameras as well in some of my videos, or even an A camera in some of the videos I've made too. But I do have plans to use this for some little shorts, some more narrative-driven work. It's just a beautiful image, obviously, as it is a cinema camera. But the 1535 has been suiting me perfectly fine in that respect. I'm not having any issues with the autofocus. I would like something that's a little wider that is natively RF, but there isn't really anything out there right now to satisfy that need unless you buy a Speedbooster and then use EF glass. Now, the reason for me going with RF glass is it is essentially the future. It's already on cameras like the Red Komodo. The RF lenses hold their value very, very well. EF lenses in general are losing their value, so I thought if I was going to invest in a system, it was going to be the RF system. I also really liked the control ring. I know a lot of people don't use it on the front there, but I actually use it quite frequently for ISO, for aperture, changing it around now and then. So I actually really like having that on there too. Now, I was also very interested in trying out some cinema glass, and there was a few different options I was looking at, but I didn't want to spend a huge amount of money on them as I am a Sony shooter and I don't want to invest in a ton more glass. So I ended up getting an adapter which allows me to use my Helios 442, which is an M42 mount. So this is an M42 to RF. It goes right on the camera. There's no issues. It works perfectly fine. Obviously, it's manual focus. So I love this little lens. It's cheap. It's got a really unique, weird, quirky image to it, and that was part of the reason I wanted to use it on the C70. Now, on top of that, I also wanted to use a proper big cinema lens, and I was looking at some Mikey lenses and some other ones, but I already had a Mikey lens for Sony, and I went on Mikey's website and came across a conversion kit to transfer my E-mount Mikey cinema lens to a EF mount, which I have done. It actually took a nice chunk off the top there, so it's actually quite a bit smaller than it was before, and now I just have the EF to RF adapter on there, and this works perfectly fine. Again, manual focus, but this works really well on the C70, and I'm really excited to use this specifically for some more narrative-driven short form films that I've kind of got in the works. So that is my choices of lenses for the Canon C70. That's all I got for you, Josh. Thank you for having me on.
Huge thanks to Andrew, Dave, and Chris for sharing their insights. I will leave their channels linked all down below. You should definitely go check them out. So I want to go over some of the stuff that they mentioned and some similarities, and then I'll also give you what I'm using and my recommendations. All right, so Andrew uses a lot of cinema lenses, which is really cool, and he uses a basic EF to RF adapter, and it works really well for him, of course, using Super 35 lenses on a Super 35 camera, but he also uses a 24 to 105 with the Speedbooster for sort of more solo shooting, run and gun stuff, so he has autofocus. Now, Dave has been a longtime Canon shooter and is mainly doing YouTube content now, and he's using some older EFS lenses, the 10-18 and the 17-55. So there's some great options out there, especially now that these lenses are a little bit older, and those seem to work really well. Again, he's using Super 35 lenses on a C70. Now, Chris has got a different use case where he's a Sony user. Most of you probably already know Chris and follow him for his Sony content, but he just picked up the C70 and he picked up the RF 15-35, which is kind of a good all-purpose lens on the C70 with the crop factor. I agree with Chris also that there should be more wider lens options that are native to RF, and I think he also brought up some good points about the RF being more future-proof and some of the other features and those sort of things. So what I took away from everybody who contributed to this video is that there are just a lot of different use cases and a lot of different options. But I think one thing that I picked up about all of them is there's sort of a need for an all-arounder lens. And so, you know, the 24-105 with the Speedbooster, Dave mentioned the 17-55, and Chris with the RF 15-35. Those are kind of all good all-purpose lenses that you can go out and shoot with. Now let's get into some more details. First of all, the Speedbooster. I've mentioned this in several other videos where I really don't like the Speedbooster for the issues of the purple circle and the overall flaring and washed out look that you can get from the Speedbooster. In controlled lighting, it works really well, but for me, I'm often not shooting in controlled lighting and I don't want to worry about that. So I have the Viltrox Speedbooster here, but I've also used the Canon one. So in certain situations, it can be awesome. It gives you another stop of light and gives you that sort of full frame look. It gives you a wider view on the lenses. So it's a great option for some situations, but overall, I'm not going to be using the Speedbooster. Now, EF lenses are a great option. There's, as Dave mentioned, the EF-S lenses, which are the crop sensor lenses, which cover the Super 35 sensor. You can also use the EF lens, full frame lenses with the Speedbooster and get a really cool full frame look, as I mentioned too. The thing about EF lenses is they're great because they're super cheap, but they're designed for DSLRs and not mirrorless cameras. So often the autofocus can be loud, but otherwise the image quality of them is kind of what you expect. A lot of them are pretty good. The 16-35 f2.8 Mark III is very similar in image quality to the RF 15-35. It'd be hard to tell the difference between them, but overall, you get a lot of flexibility with EF lenses, especially if you're shooting on other cameras that have EF lenses and they can adapt to pretty much everything. Now, you have the option of the RF full-frame lenses, which I have the 15-35 and the 24-70. I really love these lenses. They're very expensive, and in a lot of ways, they feel overkill on the C70 because it's only a Super 35 sensor. But they are options. There needs to be more coming out in the lineup. I think there needs to be more prime lenses available, so we'll see what happens. Now, what I'm really curious about coming up is the new RF-S lenses. Those are the crop sensor RF lenses. There's two coming out to pair with the R7 and R10. I really hope we see more RF-S lenses coming out soon, and I would love to see sort of an L series or sort of professional level crop sensor lens. We'll see if they do that. They haven't really done that in the past, but we'll see. Vintage glass and cinema lenses are also amazing options on the C70, especially with the basic EF to RF adapter, which is only $100, or an EF to PL adapter. There's basically, you can adapt anything onto the C70, which is super awesome. So tons of options out there. I want to talk about what I use, and then I'll talk about some recommendations. So personally, I try to get the highest quality professional glass that I can that has autofocus. I generally am shooting by myself, run and gun style, sort of quick pace stuff, and I need autofocus, or if I'm filming myself, of course. And so generally, I look for a 24-70 f2.8 zoom, which would be on a full frame sensor. So for me personally, I've picked the RF 15-35 like Chris did, which gives me like a 23-53 millimeter equivalent. Now remember, we talk about equivalent focal lengths, but you do get the look out of a 15-35. So at 15, even if it's on a crop sensor camera, you're gonna get the distortion you would get on a 15. So keep that in mind too. I think a lot of us just do the multiplication. We multiply the crop factor by the focal length, but you gotta remember there's a look to certain focal lengths that you get. You're just cropping in on the center of that image. Another great option to compare for a sort of all-purpose lens on the C70 is the Sigma 18-35 Art. f1.8, which pretty much everyone knows about. I made a comparison video, which I'll leave a link down below for the Sigma versus the RF lens. So generally speaking, this is the lens that lives on my C70 most of the time, is the RF 15-35. But as I said, there are tons of options out there. Now getting on to the big question about which lenses you should get for the C70, and I think there's a lot of information here to help you figure that out and decide. But the first question you might want to ask yourself is, what other cameras do you own or use? So for me personally, my other Canon camera is the R5C, so I personally want to invest in full frame RF lenses because then I can use them on both systems. If you are just shooting on the C70 or are shooting on other Super 35 sensors, maybe you have different options with cinema glass that's made for Super 35 or EFS lenses and those sorts of things. If you're looking for prime lenses, because of course we're on a Super 35 sensor, and if you want a more shallow depth of field, I'd probably say the Sigma Art primes are your best bang for your buck, the 24, 35, 50, and 85. There's also some really nice ones, the 28, 40, and 105, which is a whole different series of lenses, which are very underrated, and I don't think a lot of people know about. But I think those are probably your best bets for prime lenses. Now, what I personally think is the RF zooms are a great purchase because they are going to hold their value really well. They're more future-proof, and of course, they're going to have the best optical quality out of any of those lenses out there because they're the newest and obviously the most expensive. Of course, keep a bunch of adapters around. Like I definitely keep the EF RF adapter around, and you know, the Speedbooster can definitely help in some situations too. So you have a lot of options to adapt lenses. Now, if you're looking for a wide angle lens, which is not really a unique problem to the C70, but really any crop sensor camera, you know, the options right now, you could get like the RF 15 to 35 or the EF 16 to 35. Of course, once you add the crop factor, it's not going to be super wide. I have the RF 16 millimeter, which I've used. I do want to make a review about this. It's a very interesting lens and very inexpensive. But as Dave mentioned, the EFS 10 to 18 is another great option. And one more I want to throw out there is the Tokina 11 to 20. That's another great wide option. So there are just so many options for the C70, and hopefully you can see sort of my struggle here that I've had over the last bit of time owning the C70 is that it's kind of hard for me to decide on which lenses to use. So a lot of things to think about here, and I'll leave links down below for as much of the equipment I can find as possible. If you enjoyed this, please consider hitting subscribe down below. It'd be greatly appreciated. A lot more nerdy camera stuff, content creation, and videography content coming out on this channel. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.